Good morning, and thank you for your patience. I'm Ashley Anderson, your facilitator. Caroline Lee and Eva Gregg are the moderators and support in the room. We might have a couple other folks pop on this morning. We welcome them as they come, and then we'll also be recording this webinar. So opening in a good way, I just always like to recognize those who came before us and the generations to come, that we are the conduits for change, and we are the people who are going to be sharing that information to this next generation and for them to know different. So good morning and hello. And this was actually one of the drums we made, and it was Danielle's drum, and it was being flown to a community, which is really great. And of course, we say thank you to OJJDP. We are funded by OJJDP, but of course, the opinions and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this aren't necessarily authors of DOJ or don't reflect DOJ necessarily. We are recording this, and so we could always go back if you need to. You could use the chat box. Feel free to chat, toggle around. Feel free to go get coffee if you need to. And we are part of the resource basket. Eva and I are now on the same team. She's with the, Eva, what grant are you under? I can't recall, but she's funded a little bit differently, but her mission is still supporting the Alaska Native youth. Oh, Mary, of course, excluding the drum kit. Absolutely, I could send that to you. Okay, let me minimize this. So what is tribal sovereignty? Functioning as an independent nation, the right to govern themselves. I've underlined certain keywords, 3 points. Own constitutions, laws, and infrastructure, so you own it. Rights to meet the needs of their people. What are your needs in your community? And their rights to land, resources, and assets. These belong to you. And I really love this video from the Native Governance Center that I'll go ahead and show here. And I will screen share that. Share sound. As I was looking into sovereignty, I'd heard this word before, and I've heard it over time, but I didn't really know what it meant. And I've really been understanding the essence of it in the last couple months, having flown to communities, really understanding what was going on with ICWA, and how as an ally I could be supporting these efforts. So I had found this video, and this was kind of the aha moment for me, because it gave me words to understand.
Tribal sovereignty. It's a phrase you've likely heard before, but what does it really mean? Sovereignty is the natural right of a people to govern themselves. Sovereignty means that tribes operate as independent nations within a nation. And did you know that there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the United States? All of these tribes have their own constitutions, laws, elections, and infrastructure designed to meet their people's needs. Their rights, lands, assets, and resources are their own. This is similar to how the United States government exercises sovereignty on behalf of its citizens. Tribal nations have been sovereign since time immemorial. Sovereignty is not granted, but rather it is recognized. The federal government recognizes tribes' sovereignty through treaties. In order to make a treaty, two sovereign nations must come together, recognize each other's right to govern their own people, and create an agreement. With or without the United States, tribal nations are sovereign. But if you need more proof, the United States Constitution, in addition to hundreds of treaties and Supreme Court cases, has repeatedly affirmed tribes' right to govern themselves. Remember, tribal nations have always been and will always be sovereign. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The United States government's frequent violations of its treaty obligations do not change that. Now that we understand what sovereignty is, why is sovereignty important? Sovereignty matters because sovereign nations know best what their people need. Tribal governments make vital decisions for their people related to healthcare, education, and economic development, among others. When Native nations make their own decisions, they are more likely to thrive. Strong, sovereign tribal governments foster strong tribal economies and nations. We honor and affirm tribal sovereignty. To learn more about why sovereignty matters, visit nativegov.org or treatiesmatter.org.
I really love that video because I was thinking, oh, okay, how can I emphasize, sovereignty within our communities right now and with our grantees? We've seen a lot of change over time, and even in the 5 years I've been in Alaska and knowing very little about sovereignty, the inequities happening in Alaska, and then seeing it firsthand when I've gone to certain communities. And how can I uplift these beautiful people or this beautiful state of Alaska as an ally? And a key word in that just really stood out to me was strong. And so strong sovereignty equals strong economies and nations. And through drumming and justice, how can we get there or continue working towards that? Even BIA, the U.S. Department of the Interior, they even have this note on their page: federally recognized tribes' sovereignty keep from further encroachment by other sovereigns such as the states. Tribal sovereignty ensures that decisions about the tribes with regard to their property and citizens are made with their permission and consent. And then they also had a little myth and fact, which was great. Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, and IHS, so Indian Health Services, are the only agencies responsible for working with tribes. The fact is, the Constitution, the executive orders, presidential memos outline policies that all executive departments have the responsibility to consult with and respect tribal sovereignty. We're also seeing this shift in conversation, and it opened up last week when DOJ reached out to us and said, what's in the way of people doing this work or applying for funding? And some of it came down to that you're not consulting with the communities. You're not asking them, nor does it feel respected. And so through different conversations, I was able to compile that and send it over to DOJ as an ally, as an advocate, and so that they could come back and say, you're right, we didn't hear that. What is it that you need? And on that very first page of this webinar, I underlined the needs of their people. And don't just create programming or offer funding that it doesn't meet the needs of the people or that there's red tape. And so we have to have these real conversations, this advocacy and justice work. And that's how this webinar really unfolded. I knew I wanted to do it. I felt a certain way about cultural activities and teachings and ancestral knowledge. And Danielle, my supervisor, said, Ashley, you need to switch it up. You need to do this drumming and justice webinar before you leave. I have this burning kind of itch to talk about it and to understand it further so that when I move, I could talk about it. So we're going to also focus on 2 of the 3 points mentioned before: the rights to meet the needs of their people, jurisdiction, and ownership, and then right to land, resources, and assets, cultural and indigenous. Jurisdiction example. So I'll go ahead through these points here. I'll give a few examples, and then we'll talk about them. So jurisdiction example, Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. So Alaska is a PL 280 state, effective over Alaska Natives within as well as an outside Indian country, transfer of legal authority jurisdiction from the federal government to state governments, which significantly changed the division of legal authority among tribal, federal, and state governments. And the outcome just recently, which is so exciting, and it is victory on June 15th, 2023, U.S. Supreme Court upheld the 1978 ICWA. The decision was a 7-2 vote, meant that the law will continue to require giving preference to placing adoptable Native American children in Native families. We're exercising sovereignty in that, right? We are saying no, young people, when they're connected to a community, need to stay in that community. And we know this over time from stories and storytelling and different books that may have not been in the schools, but talking about the loss of culture and connection and ultimately the spirit. And so going back to this and having victory was, it's so compelling and it's so exciting. And both Eva and I would love for Eva and Caroline maybe to chime in on more about PL 280. I just learned about this about 2 months ago in a conversation with Caroline. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she was able to talk more about it. And they're both online today. And Eva wrote your thesis in school about PL 280. So if you could emphasize or talk more about that right now, this would be the perfect time.
Good morning. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Eva, thank you.
Okay, so as part of my education, I had to do a practicum at the end of it, and I chose to do it at Partners Reentry Center. And one of the assignments that they gave me there was to read the PL 280 law. I am not an expert. I am not a lawyer. I'm a social worker, right? And I was a student of UAA as a student of the social work department. But I do remember, like, I was so confused about, okay, so they gave us all this power, but then what does this other part mean? Like, so I really had to think about it. So they gave us all this power and all this jurisdiction, but no money to actually enforce those jurisdictions and any laws, like anything that happens on tribal lands. Like if there's a police department, then then the tribes have to fund it, right? If there's so whatever the need is for the tribes, if the money's not there, then we're still stuck, right? And that's where the funding comes in. That's where our grant writers need to understand that, like, okay, we have this power, we have our boundaries, we have our own ways of doing things, we have our own systems, we have our own, views on spirituality, all this. And those were forgotten, and like, not forgotten, but almost eradicated since contact. But we can bring those back, right? Because now we have some infrastructural and judicial power given back to us that should have never been taken away, right? So we can get our grant writers to think about what our people need within the boundaries that our jurisdictions can allocate and produce and disseminate and actually bring healing to our people. I'll stop right there and allow Miss Caroline to.
Amazing, Eva, that you did your practicum on that, being from a social services background, because this is such an important law for all of our tribes to look at. Can you hear me okay? PL 280 states, from the legal perspective, I am not a lawyer, but I am trained in the law, and PL 280 states have concurrent criminal jurisdiction with the state of Alaska. We have inherent rights to protect the public safety and welfare of our community members. That is an inherent right, part of our sovereignty that was never taken away. We've always had it. They just re-outlined in a lot of public law 280 states that we have concurrent criminal jurisdiction with the state. What that means is that our laws cannot conflict with the laws of the state regarding criminal jurisdiction. And our jurisdiction outline has been redrawn. If you look at the 2000, actually the current census now, you will see maps of Alaska that outline your tribes. I'll put the link in the chat in a little bit. That outlines your village, communities, territory, where you can utilize those maps to help protect the public safety and welfare of your community. The Public Law 280 just means we have concurrent jurisdiction with the state. Thank you.
Thank you both, Eva and Caroline, and being able to expand more and hear your passion about it and two different perspectives as a social worker and law trained. And I get to be the facilitator of these conversations. So thank you for sharing. And Caroline is again with ATJRC, Eva's with Resource Basket. So anytime that you have additional questions or opportunities to expand this work, feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure that you feel connected to them or are connected to them. Land example. So now we looked at jurisdiction. Now we're moving into land example. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, INCSA. The entire state of Alaska falls under the jurisdiction of Alaska Region, with a small exception of Annette Island Reserve, which falls under Northwest Region. And we have 229 federally recognized tribes under this jurisdiction. And INCSA also mandated that both regional and village corporations be owned and enrolled by Alaska Native shareholders. And it is the foundation of INCSA, that corporate ownership of Alaska Natives. And again, I'm underlining these key words, is that you are the conduit, you are the person of change. And it might take some time, but we will continue to practice and exercise sovereignty. And we'll continue to have these conversations of ownership. So to reduce that encroachment or further encroachment of other nations and states. And then resources and subsistence, right? Subsistence and hunting and gathering use of wild resources, birds, mammals, fish, plants from the tundra, forests, streams, and rivers. And yet, and I don't know where this may be going, but when I got to visit a community and there was no fishing on the Yukon. Wait, you have the right to land and to hunt and gather and fish. Because it not only is it your way of life, but you need it to survive, but yet you can't do that right now because of other things happening. And so I feel a strong way of like, well, no, that's your way of life. This is your land, right? And so some prefer the phrase our way of life because subsistence practices are closely bound to the lifestyle of Alaska Natives who have long relied upon the land, not only to provide for subsistence, but also rich and diverse cultural traditions. So it's cultural practices as well. And Eva had mentioned it like spiritual, right? There's such great spiritual sense in Alaska, something I'd never felt before coming here. And also subsistence is key to maintaining and preserving Alaska Native cultures, how you've done it over time. So BIA actually said this, long-standing traditions are associated with gathering, processing, preparing, sharing of subsistence foods among Alaska Native people, knowledge about harvest techniques, preparation methods, the concepts of sharing and community integrity are passed from elders to young people through participation in subsistence activities, keeping alive these traditions and values. So the drumming and justice, right? Sending off a drum, it's the spirit of that activity and the values and traditions over time. And it's so important to continue doing these things, even if there's a bit of encroachment or it has been paused. No, let's get that back. And I see the chat box. This is what brought INCSA to fruition. Yes. And then Caroline has her email in the chat box. Alaska Natives and the land. And this is what brought INCSA to fruition. Thank you so much, Eva. And as I'm learning INCSA, I had heard it over time, but what did it really mean? And so it's your way of life. And we'll continue to have these very difficult conversations. And when we're having difficult conversations and bringing things to light and continuing this work, it's doing leadership in our communities. And I just want to add a note here. I was able to meet the family of Miss Katie John. I met this gentleman named Fred John. Katie was his aunt, and he remembers being 5 or 6 years old, staying at Miss Katie's house. This is before he was sent to boarding school. He remembers being at her house, and she and a number of other people were going to the Supreme Court, going to courts, going to people, finding people to help them with subsisting and making sure that subsistence was still written in. And Fred John says, as a little boy, he remembers this man who came to their porch and dropped off a basket. And the person that had dropped this off was working with the state and apologized to Miss Katie. Said, I'm so sorry that we were trying to take this away. This is your way of life. And Fred John, he was able to share that when I visited Mentasta Village. And he said it was a little boy, he remembers hearing those apologies. We need those apologies still. We need action taken to reverse some of these things. Well, I know we won't be able to reverse the hurt and the harm, but I feel a responsibility to make sure that everybody has subsisting cultural activities, spirituality, even if it's in the grant, right? That is something that they need to include. So I feel a certain way to be able to share that, the stories, and to share it with Washington, D.C., because there's such a disconnect. And we also have a grant manager coming from D.C. in 3 weeks to Alaska for the first time. And she's only going to see a little glimmer of what Alaska Natives and Alaska brings, because it has really, truly changed me. I could go on a tangent about it, but preparing her to see the wonders of Alaska. And then Indigenous practices example, Indian self-determination and education assistance, ISDEAA. Self-determination, it's the process by which a person controls their own life, such as exercising values for one's own benefit. Values come from community, generativity, so ancestral knowledge and shared practices over time. And this was amended in 1975, delegated the authority to Indian tribes to assume administrative responsibility for federally funded programs designed to benefit primarily the services which are administered by the BIA. So the BIA has a big emphasis on this, but it doesn't mean that DOJ cannot, right? Or BJA. They all should, designed to benefit. And so you have sovereignty, you have the authority, and you have the jurisdiction to run programs that are designed to benefit your community. And when DC comes back and asks, well, what's getting in the way of people applying? We said, well, it's not designed to benefit. This is actually bringing in more harm than helping and supporting what we need. I've even had conversations with some folks who say, I just want to give up on this grant because it's not meant for us. It's not suited for us. So they're like almost like wrapping it up. We need to shift that. We need to change that. What conversations do we need to have? I'm going to check the chat box here. Yes, VAWA. Enhance our tribal jurisdiction. You could find the community maps under the regional corporation tab there. So feel free to click on that link. Thank you, Caroline. So how does this show up? Elders passing on Indigenous knowledge and values, engaging with the land, harvesting for traditional medicines, birch bark baskets, and berry picking. All the things I've learned in Alaska, I now feel a responsibility to show my children. I've even been able to speak it to my family and my in-laws. Even like plucking your hair. And I think I've said this many of times before. So I could speak to the land and say thank you, right? And I just leave that there where I've plucked the berries and not taking more than I need. I'm going to go fishing, giving the first fish we catch to an elder and then to somebody else. And then the third one is that we keep. So when we went fishing 2 weeks ago, we didn't eat any of the fish. We actually I dried it, and now it's going to be sent off to my dad. right? And so there's certain practices, and I feel really strong to now because you've taught me this. Using tribally curated and built locations for traditional practices, the Goskoks making difficult decisions. So you have a name for this beautiful building or a space to have these decisions, talking circles and circle facilitation, ceremonies like goans and chalichahak, cleansing ceremonies, steam baths, amakbi. I saw that in Bethel for the first time, and both Caroline and Danielle were telling me about it. And oh my gosh, I didn't know, and how spiritual that could be. Traditional hunting and fishing practices. So from set nets and dip netting and traditional smokehouses. Caroline, I might say this incorrectly. Manyak, cooking the first thing you catch and everybody sharing it. Drum and song, harvesting the wood, respecting the animal and its offering, dance and connection to the spiritual world. And even the drum that I have in my office, I don't know any of the songs and I don't know any of the dances, but I do feel connection to the animal. And as Danielle and I were making it and we were stretching it, pulling it and tightening it, there's certain markings from this animal, and every marking is different, just like we are and our communities are. And I can't wait to hang this in my new house so everybody could see it and say that's fine. I'm connected to that. So my question to you, how does this show up? How do you practice sharing your cultural knowledge with your family and community? What are some traditional practices you wish to share to this next generation? Feel free, you could use the chat box. Let me see. Oh, something just popped up. Can we unmute? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I think for some reason, I can't see my video. But I guess the one thing that I wish to bring back is I wish I had a home where I could teach kids or young women, not necessarily keeping them for the whole time that when they first started their becoming a woman, because the values behind that, of your body and knowing your body and spiritually and what that means to a Native Indigenous person and what you learn during that time. I think that's a huge value for our young women, because of this time and age of trafficking, sexual abuse, physical abuse. I really think it's something that we should get back to, because they don't have that anymore. And it's noticeable in our young women sometimes. So that's what I wish. I don't know what my boss tried to clean my camera. Slide. Weird.
This covers the camera.
Oh, maybe I got it now. I'm not sure.
I still don't see you, Sia, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And I have heard that was a practice at one point, and I don't know much about it, but certain things that keep young people safe.
Mhm.
Isn't that the work that we're doing? Why we're doing this work is to keep people
Mhm.
safe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One
for
day
sharing.
I'll have a place.
You will, and I have great hope for you.
Thank you.
Keep doing this good work because it'll happen. We have to,
Yeah.
yes. And Eva, were you going to share something?
Yes. So, like I put in the chat that I'm now overseeing the youth development culture grants, and so the funding was just released on the 1st, and I'm going over the applications. But for those of you who are on this Zoom meeting right now, And I'll be sure to put my email address in the chat box. So, see, something you're talking about in my culture, we had kasagaks, and there is the men's and the women's, and then there was the communal, right? And that the communal was where everyone gathered to eat together, to drum and dance together, work on projects together. But then the women's and men's kasagaks, women were and girls were only allowed in the women and girls kasagak, and only men and boys were allowed in theirs. And then what happened in these two were traditional knowledge was being shared from one generation to the next in regards to gender roles, which were very important, back in our history, in our culture. Gender roles were to ensure survival, one. So next year, because I think this round, all the funds for this next round of RFPs is going to be spent. But next year will be another rolling year of funding. So this is something you could, this is like using the money, the mini grants for youth development culture grants. You could design a week-long culture, camp for girls in one tent and for boys in the other, and have it mimic, because all cultures in Alaska had some kind of structures like this, right? And so that is one way that you could incorporate this into your programming and funding, is where I was going with that, the long route. So there are ways that we can write these into our programming. We just have to figure out, one, is it doable? Is it allowable? And two, do we have the knowledge and the capabilities and the people to bring this about? And I'll stop right there. Thanks.
And thank you, Eva, for sharing, and also more about certain grants that potentially could bring this to fruition and emulating those practices. I'd only heard about a Kaskak from the, not Charlie Trahawk, it was Kongosvik. I said, but where are they? And I know that when you go to the Heritage Center and they have certain buildings that it's named and they would tell us about it, but why isn't it being practiced? And to me, I said, what happened, right? That's my question of what happened and how can we bring that back? What are the barriers to those things? And so, Sia, keep having these conversations, right? You might be the facilitator, but then finding the people with the knowledge. And Eva also made a great point of, community knowledge, and how can we support you in this? So thank you for sharing. So how do you practice sharing your cultural knowledge with your family and community? And what are some traditional practices you wish to share to this next generation? And so the how piece, I also think of it as leadership, right? When we're just doing it and other people will watch, they will do the same. And in the chat box, I'll see a thank you. And then the next question is my responsibility. What are some traditional practices you wish to share to this next generation? And I know the team has heard it many, many times, and you may have heard it on my last webinar. My grandmother, she's passed now, but she'd always say, I don't have much, but I have my hands. And I think of her cooking and storytelling and serving other people and knitting and making things. She didn't have much, but we had blankets that kept us warm and food in our bellies. She had a garden that was always beautiful and the biggest orange tree you'd ever see. And at her memorial in 2 weeks, I said, I could do all of these things because she's taught me, right? So I also have to show my children and just continue doing them so that they see it and they feel a connection to her, their great grandmother. But so what are some other practices in your community? How are you doing them? And what are some things that you wish to share? maybe hope for the future.
Maybe we ask it this way. If you had all power and all the money, and you could make all the rules to make all peoples healthy, what would that look like?
It's a great point, Eva.
No, a lot of you in your community practice this every day without even knowing it. I teach my grandchildren and my children how to cut fish. Miss Ashley was just talking about how you give your first catch away. My godson caught his first fish in Casilla and gave me his first fish. I'm honored to cook it, and I'm trying to make what do you call it? Caviar with the eggs, because there was eggs in it. I tell my children these stories like, Sia, your amazing wish for your women to have a safe place to talk to them about their womanhood. I'm going to put in the chat our CTAS grants. There's a Purpose Area 4 grant that might be able to help renovate a building in your community that can be served for that purpose. Sewing, I sew with my children and my grandchildren. I'm kind of teaching how to make dust bucks. Crocheting and putting really good energy into what you're making is something my grandmother taught me. And those are conversations that I have with my children and my grandchildren and my coworkers. I talk to Ashley about this, and I hear so many things from Eva too about what she does to share her native food, sharing and eating together, right, in our potlatches. But not only that, when we're having meetings or when we're having hard conversations, having food at the table and you know, being respectful of everybody and teaching our children how to talk to each other, you know, in a good way so that we can make good change. So many different things that we can harvesting, like you said, Ashley, only what we need, don't over harvest. Ashley taught me how to make spruce, what do you call it?
Spruce tip salve.
Spruce tip salve, and I am marinating some spruce tips that I did not over harvest and cook, but I'm marinating them in olive oil, and you can marinate them and leave them in there for like anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. And I didn't know how to make that. Thank you, Ashley. I'm learn one, teach one. I'm making a batch, and I was honored to learn that from you. All this knowledge that we share, we do it on a regular basis. These circles when we were in Potluck. Ashley and Danielle facilitated an amazing 3 Little Pigs circle that was hilarious, but also taught every aspect of what a real healing circle can be. There's just so many things we can do in our community, and it just takes us, it takes a village. I read this quote on the Federal Bar Association website. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. It takes a village. Leanna.
Thank you, Caroline. And I learned how to make salve because my friend who's Tlingit Haida showed me, and we were doing it with young people. And she said, well, they need to know how to take care of themselves and how to give. And so I set it up exactly the same way of how she taught me and how her grandmother had showed her. And from marinating and the salve, that time we did Devil's Club. And then with Caroline, we did spruce tips. And so even the harvesting aspect, not taking more than we need, using sustainable items for it. So using glass because you could use it over and over again, not throwing anything away. And then we'd lay out the tins, and ideally everybody gets 2. And she said it's 1 to give and then 1 to keep. And then as you're putting the essential oils together, you're smelling them and you're closing your eyes and you're thinking of who can I give this to? And the first person maybe that comes to mind, or someone who has an ailment, And so then you write their name on it, and that's who you give it to, right? And so, and it just, you feel some type of empowerment, something when you give, right? And these young people, sure, they might be clicking likes or the heart button on Instagram. That is not sharing, that is not giving, and it's the true act. And I remember this goes back to a story with my grandmother. I was turning 13. My birthday fell on Thanksgiving every 6 years. And she said, okay, you're going to come over and we are going to make cakes for your birthday. Oh, okay. So and everything was made from scratch. And so we did it together. And then she goes, now we're going to go deliver it to the fire department. And it wasn't for me. And I get there and they had this big sign that said happy birthday. And I got to share my birthday on Thanksgiving with these firemen who weren't able to be home with their families. And we sat there and just had a wonderful meal together and celebrated. And it was great. And I was 13 years old. And it was a memory that I'll never forget, right? And that feeling of giving, and she was instilling that in me, and it's showing up here in Alaska as well, right? With me, my children, and these other activities, and then also using our hands. And I've learned how to make fry bread from 2 different people. It was a friend's grandmother, but then also when I was back in Mentasta, and you know, the texture is right when you close your eyes, right? You could feel it with your hands. You don't have to see it. And I thought, wow. And teaching that to the young people when they're feeling overwhelmed, close your eyes. What is it telling you that it's needing? So we're connecting to our other senses. And this young person had been very overwhelmed and going through mental health. And she became overwhelmed. I said, let's close our eyes. And what does it feel like? And what do you need? She said, it needs a little bit more water. And we were able to breathe together and make this really good fry bread together. And then during the same activity, I learned how to make a gurak. And I now know how to make a gurak in 2 different ways. And so sharing that. And now my children know how to make it. And my son will lick every single finger because he likes it so much. And so just these wonderful practices that we get to share together. And I hope that my children will remember these moments and that they will continue to share it because you've taught me. And Caroline, you say it, teach one, learn one, teach one, and I'm always learning. So I am always learning. And the chat box here. Oh, yes. The CTAS purpose area 4. So thank you, Caroline, for adding that in the chat box. And then as I was doing this presentation, I was thinking of the friends in the lower 48 that I have who are connected to their communities. And I'd reach out to my friend Margaret, and she's with Muckleshoot in Washington State. And I said, how do you exercise your sovereignty? And what's going on soon that you are really excited for? And she was telling me about the annual canoe journey that will happen July 31. And she said, we use our sovereign material, actually. We harvest the wood on Muckleshoot land. We carve and treat, and only tribal members are carving it and treating it. And they'll take that canoe all the way from the Puget Sound to the ocean. And as they're doing it, they're also blessing the Salish waters. And then they're engaging other tribal communities as well. So they're sharing, they're connecting, they're teaching. And as an outcome, they've been able to make it to the ocean. That's resilience, right? And she said they have these practices and ceremonies that have been done for lifetimes. They know how to engage with others, plants, animals, and all the work in harmony. And I thought that was such a beautiful statement that they're all working in harmony to have this happen and to continue exercising their sovereignty. So again, this was from my friend Meg in Muckleshoot. Margaret is her name, but we call her Meg. I am learning. Yes, I am learning. Ooh. Okay, so what's next? Also the identification of what's missing. PL 280 has a number of statements where it says like there's misunderstandings. Public Law 280 is a complicated statute, which has been very controversial since the time of its enactment in 1953. It has often been misunderstood and misapplied to both federal and state governments. And so what's missing or misunderstandings, and how do we have these real conversations? And then advocacy and building up allyship, teaching and sharing stories, and we need to know different, building the community of allies. And so we have strength in numbers, and Caroline to say that we could, don't go very far just as a single person, but we could go even further with many, and conversations with our funders saying this is too much red tape. This is keeping us from doing this work. It's actually harder now to navigate these things with this grant, perhaps. OJJ grants some of the most difficult grants to navigate, rules and regulations. And so, and these are statements from some people who have said that, about the OJJDP grants. And so you are funded by OJJDP. And so we bring to light these conversations. Having the right fit, design of grants and programs. We already have this agreement in place. BIA and many of these federal websites say it, designed to fit. It's the right fit. And so you could even turn down grants, even post solicitation, saying, you know what, this isn't going to be the right fit. This is not for us because it's encroaching on our sovereignty. It's encroaching on what we believe. And you could say no, right? And then using us to find additional funding or helping the funders change the language. And that's what we're doing right now. So the path itself, not the destination, is what will change us. We are changing things right now. And I get to stand there just in honor with Caroline and Danielle and the community of Kotlik on the river. And I felt so excited and proud to be with people walking this journey together. And I was in like my best space and I was dancing along the water, and Danielle even took a picture of me and she goes, "You just look so happy." And I said, "I am, because I've learned so much and to now be an ally to do this work." So taking action, we also have healing to wellness courts happening. So you could bring in your practices and making sure that you tailor your court codes for the right fit, having conversations with funders. I continue to say it, but this is the biggest one right now, and expectations of grants. And the tribes need to know what they need, the advocacy. Oh, the tribes know what they need, the advocacy. So we talk to the funders about it. We have this need. We know what's right. And then the expectation of the grants. And then intertwining practices, guidelines and practices for ethical and respectful engagement with Indigenous senses and sensibilities. So this book called Towards Braiding, I actually have a free version that I'll share out with everyone of, in this very Western set, how can you bring in your Indigenous practices? And even the square and circle on this book. Circle, we know that everyone has a piece of this pie, right? Everybody has a role to play in their community, and it's circle. And yet the Western practices are very harsh and corners and siloed. And so how can we intertwine this and make change over time? And then the wellness wheel, community connection and responsibility. This is the wheel of wellness from Kotlik. And we did this really fun activity where everybody got to talk about their different practices in their communities from every month. And even though I kind of put you on the spot a couple of slides back of what are you practicing and how and what do you wish to share, when we did this activity, there was so much in this wheel and so many things on each page. I said, you know what you're doing, you know what you need, and continue doing those things. And then there's expectations for people to do certain things. So everybody took a role or to be part of a meeting or to help facilitate these activities. And then there's also an expectation from the youth or by the youth. They could see it and they know that that's happening. December wasn't quite filled out yet. We were still working on it. But it just, look how many things are happening each month, right? But when you're put on the spot, you kind of go, oh, I don't know. And then hearing from our team, unfortunately, Kimberly wasn't able to make it today, but Caroline and Eva, if there's any other takeaways or other resources, I know that you've been sharing that in the chat box, but what other tools or resources could you refer our tribal members and others here today to continue exercising sovereignty? I mentioned it as just continuing talking with funders, talking about that red tape, continuing doing your cultural activities, holding circle, perhaps creating that space for young men and women or girls and boys to learn Through Charlie Chahak, I had learned that women and men, we think much differently. And so they actually separate the tracks, men and women. And so we learn also by being in these tracks. So if there's anything else you'd like to share, this would be the space. Yes, yeah. Let's see here. It is each person, oh, Eva, it is each person's duty to share their piece of knowledge and wisdom. That is my opinion. Right. I think that is a responsibility for all of us to continue to share. But if there's any other resources you'd like to add to the chat box or to share, Eva or Caroline, this would be the space to do that.
I'm going to share a resource in just a minute, but I'd like to say, you talk about tribal sovereignty, and just to reiterate that we as tribes, we have an inherent right, and that means it has never been taken away. We have an inherent right to protect and self-govern our people. And it has never been taken away from us. So to know that and to practice, we've been practicing these practices for time immemorial. We are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, and to use that and know that they are behind us, and to keep practicing our culture and teaching our children, our grandchildren, and our future generations, so that we know our language, so that we know our cultures, so that we know our ceremonies, will only help empower our communities. And the link I'll be sharing, I don't know if all of you have heard of the Alaska Tips app. It's something that I've been sharing a lot lately. It's a free app you can download and anonymously report safety, public safety issues in your community, because a lot of us don't have police officers in our community. And this is a really good tip line for you to share that, so that you can alert the authorities to the things that are going on in your community. And they do notice, and they will respond and help you with that. But it takes all of us to keep reporting these things. We all have public safety issues in the community, so I'm going to share that also. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I'll go back to the chat here. Go ahead, Eva.
I really don't have anything else to add. Yeah. It's been a wonderful hours with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. So overall, we'll be wrapping it up here. When you practice cultural activities, connect with your community, and use natural resources and land, keep the rights to your jurisdiction, and you are exercising tribal sovereignty. Retention and reclamation of traditional language and cultural practices, recognizing and identifying strengths in the community can provide insight for possible interventions, such like DOJ and funding opportunities, shared sense of collective community responsibility, kinship ties, just like ICWA, sustainable and natural support systems for community. So much can get worked through within teams and between tribal, state, and university partners, where it begins with an open problem-solving mindset with recurrent training, where professionals are committed to cross-training each other. Successful teamwork includes the building and maintenance of ongoing relationships. This is the sweet spot where innovation, cultural tailoring, and recovery happens. This was said by Judge Pat Sikwatwa, Hopi Appellate Court. I got to work closely with her, and she's now with TLPI. I actually had a dream about TLPI last night, interestingly enough, but they have publications and other resources as well. But she really emphasized, the teamwork and the relationships. We get so much done with connection in our community and positive relationships. And so we hope that we can intertwine that with other practices and agencies, and we could teach them different. So your takeaway activity, if you haven't already received it, will be your drum kit. Have everyone participate in making the drum. We are all part of the circle. When the circle is missing someone, we can't actually tighten the drum. When everyone holds onto one of the holes and the sinew or the lacing, it's not as vibrant as if everybody had a piece, right? So we can't do things alone. It's also a spiritual reconnection to maybe that animal that we it gave its life. And then also we could look at the markings on the leather and how we feel connected to it. And we are all part of the community in the land below our feet. We all have a role to play. And this was just a great photo of this, the community of Kotlik, and this woman smiling. She just was so happy during this time and smiling. And we just felt this certain sense of connection during this time. And they had never made one before, but I was taught, and then I was able to bring that in, and then we were able to purchase more drums to send to you. So when you are feeling a disconnect with your community or your agency, maybe do this community or do this activity, and then from there holding circle. And if you need circle facilitation, we could definitely help you with that. And then using the drum maybe as an opening song or closing, or putting it in the center. I saw this in many goans of having a centerpiece for a spiritual piece. And so the drum could be in the center of that. And so this was your takeaway activity. Please do this with your community or maybe some of the youth, and learn one, teach one, if I'm saying that correctly. Oh, perfect, Caroline. Thank you for adding that in the chat box. So I'm very excited for you to do your drum kit. Continue having these powerful conversations, because I am learning and I'm hearing you, and I'm seeing the change happening. Additionally, our funders need to know different, and that's my role right now. So thank you for joining us. I'll go ahead and put the link to the SurveyMonkey at the end, and thank you for bearing with me through the Zoom. When I did the link for the date, it added the Teams box. So apologies, all of the webinars will be on Zoom. And of course, anytime you need us for anything, you could reach out to Resource Basket at ruralcap.org. And then closing in a good way. This is my last webinar with Resource Basket and Rural Cap. I leave Alaska in just about 4 weeks. And I have this burning need to continue these conversations. And so thank you for teaching me, and we'll continue to stay in connection, I hope, so that many generations to come will know different. And so I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me in your space and teaching me and inviting me to your communities. I've been to 15 villages, and I would always say, I'm going to go to the 229 before I leave Alaska, but I made it to 15, and I'm still very proud of the work that I've done. And to leave here to say, I'm good with leaving, right? Like I'm okay with it. I have peace with it. It took me a little bit, even though I was grieving through it, but again, I just have immense gratitude. It's more than thank you, but I have gratitude for everything. Oh, and I do want to add in the link where we ordered the drums from. They were actually sent from the lower 48, but you could order them in batches and drumsticks. But I did a takeaway activity as well. So when you make the drum kit with, or the drum itself with your community, you could actually have young people make a drumstick, and they actually have to harvest. So through that practice of harvesting the sticks, the wood, the leather, you might be able to intertwine some other values with that as well. So Koyana, thank you. You know, Basi and many other words, but gratitude and thank you for letting me host this last webinar. But Eva and Caroline will be available.